Let's talk about one of the most difficult, most uncomfortable topics for anyone who reads the Bible: slavery. It's right there, in a text millions consider sacred, laws about owning people. So what are we supposed to make of that? Were these laws trying to regulate a brutal practice and make it more humane? Or were they giving a divine thumbs up to something we now see as absolutely evil?
So let's just cut right to the chase. The big question is blunt. Does the Old Testament condone slavery? Well, the answer is anything but simple. People have been fighting over this for centuries, and honestly, you can find ammo for both sides right there in the text itself.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to define our terms, which is super important here. Then we'll look at the laws that people point to as being surprisingly humane. After that, we'll dive into the really tough passages that critics say are indefensible. We'll touch on the history of this debate and wrap up with the big question that all of this leaves us with today.
Okay, before we go any further, we have to get our language straight. This is absolutely crucial. See, the original Hebrew has a word that gets translated as both slave and servant, but it seems to be talking about two very different kinds of labor.
First up is chattel slavery. This is probably what you're picturing when you hear the word slavery. It's a system where a human being is treated as legal property, a thing. They can be bought, sold, inherited, and their children are automatically born into slavery too.
But then there's this other category, what a lot of scholars call indentured servitude. Now, in the ancient world, this was basically a way to survive. If you were in crushing debt or starving, you could voluntarily enter a long-term labor contract to pay it off. It was a terrible choice, but it was a choice.
And when you put them side by side like this, the difference is just night and day. For defenders of the Old Testament, this distinction is everything. For a Hebrew person, it was a temporary, 6-year contract you entered into because of debt. It was not being kidnapped and forced into lifelong inherited bondage. They argue we're talking about two fundamentally different systems.
So let's explore that argument a bit. The idea here is that for its time, the Law of Moses was actually a huge moral leap forward. It gave legal protections to laborers and treated them like human beings, not just tools.
I mean, check some of these out. Everybody got the Sabbath day off to rest, including servants. If a master injured a servant, we're talking even just knocking out a tooth, that servant had to be set free. We already mentioned Hebrew servants were freed after 6 years, and get this was unheard of back then. If a foreign slave ran away to Israel, you were forbidden from returning them to their master. You had to give them safe harbor.
And this isn't just a modern reinterpretation. Scholars, like the ones behind the Anchor Bible Dictionary, point out that these were some of the very first laws in world history to say, hey, these people have rights. They're not just property.
But the real linchpin of this entire argument, the law that supporters say changes the whole conversation, is a powerful, clear prohibition against the very thing that powered modern slavery, kidnapping.
I mean, you can't get much clearer than that. Exodus 21:16 says if you kidnap someone to sell them, or if you're even caught with a kidnapped person, the punishment is death, period. Think about it. That single law would have made the entire transatlantic slave trade a capital crime.
And this powerful idea of shared humanity, which that law in Exodus seems to champion, became a rallying cry for the abolitionist movement centuries later, who fought against the horrors of race-based chattel slavery.
Okay, but that is not the whole picture, not by a long shot. And this is where things get really difficult, because critics will point out that while some laws protected Hebrews, other laws seem to explicitly approve of the very chattel slavery we just talked about. Right, so the question you have to ask is, did all those protections we just saw apply to everyone? The text itself reveals a sharp and frankly a deeply troubling distinction between how you treated an Israelite and how you treated a foreigner. This passage from Leviticus is really at the heart of the problem. It flat out says you can buy slaves from the nations around you, you can make them slaves for life, and you can pass them on to your children as inherited property. To anyone reading that today, it sounds exactly like chattel slavery. And this chart just lays out the brutal difference. An Israelite servant was basically a hired worker on a 6-year contract. A foreign slave was lifelong property, and their children were born into that same status. It's like two completely separate and unequal legal systems. And then you have verses like this one from Exodus. It says, a master who beats a slave so badly they can't get up for a day or two faces no punishment if they recover. And the reason the text gives is just chilling, since the slave is their property. That one phrase is so hard to get past.
So, what are we left with? A text that seems to have it both ways. One minute it's humanizing servitude, the next it seems to be codifying chattel slavery.
And believe me, this isn't a new fight. This conflict has been raging for centuries. On one side, you have the view that says, look, you have to see this in its historical context. Compared to the societies around them, these laws were a radical step forward, a huge moral improvement.
But on the other side, you have pure moral outrage. This view says context doesn't matter when you're talking about something this evil. Trying to excuse it, they'd argue, is just as bad as excusing any other atrocity. And you can feel the raw anger in a comment like this.
And this isn't just some modern internet debate. Back in 19th century America, these exact same scriptures were used by both sides. Pro-slavery preachers quoted from Leviticus. Christian abolitionists quoted from Exodus. They both held up the same book and claimed it was on their side.
And that complicated history brings us right back to today, to the most important question of all. With all this tension and contradiction, how are we even supposed to read these texts now?
So, what's the verdict? Are we looking at a document that was in its own flawed way pushing a brutal society towards a better future? Or is this a text that gave a divine stamp of approval to a system of complete oppression?
In the end, that's the question that won't go away. Was the goal here to humanize an unavoidable evil of the ancient world, to put limits on it and take a step away from sheer brutality? Or did these laws actually codify an injustice so deep that we are still wrestling with its echoes today? That is the enduring puzzle of slavery in the Old Testament.